I'd like to call to order this committee of the whole meeting, this planning meeting for April 18th, 2017. First order of business is additions, deletions, or amendments to the agenda, and we have nothing under that this evening. The next item is declarations of pecuniary interest, and again, I'll remind every member of your responsibility to do so. Next item 4, adoption of minutes. We have nothing there. Public meetings, nothing. Committee of the whole. We have 3 reports this evening. 4 reports. The first one is the zoning bylaw amendment Z-8-17.48, Town of Saugeen Shores, Deer Run Court, and I will ask our planner to present the report.
Mr. Mayor, thank you very much. Right, so we're back from the statutory public meeting that Council held on March 20th, 2017 to have this rezoning application presented to Council and to the public interested in the file. So we're here now having evaluated the feedback that we received and the merits of the application. We're back with a recommendation. To just make sure we're all on the same page, the planning process is just about complete. Certainly after receiving the complete application, we circulated the information to property owners within 400 meters of this parcel. That initiated a public consultation period, which led to the statutory public meeting month. Ultimately, once Council deems it appropriate to make a decision on this rezoning application, we'll start an appeal period for 20 days. So to recap, the application proposes to rezone a parcel of land owned by the municipality in Southampton in order to facilitate residential development, but also, importantly, to implement the mitigation measures that are recommended in the environmental impact study. This is a site plan of what the land currently looks like. Excuse me. So just the parcel identified as development lands would be rezoned to R1-81-H, and as a reminder, the -H is to recognize that there is archaeological potential on portions of this property. So it's our recommendation that the holdings stay on the property so no building permits can be issued until a licensed archaeologist has either completed an archaeological assessment or has deemed that there is no longer high potential on the property. There would also be 2 environmental protection zones. One is identified by the gray strip, that is EP28. That is a no-touch zone, absolutely no cutting trees or site disturbance, which ultimately protects the integrity of the larger EP-29, the green area, to be zoned. The existing zoning actually has, I'll just go back there for a second, quite a bit more land in a planned development zone, and as a result of this application, there would be more land appropriately placed into an environmental protection. Yes. Staff has completed its evaluation of the application. There have been no concerns raised by the agencies or by the public, and certainly not by municipal staff. So our recommendation is that the rezoning for town property report be approved.
Thank you, Leah. Then I'll read the recommendation and we'll take any questions. Recommendations is that zoning bylaw amendment Z-8-17.48 be approved and the Council of the Town of Saugeen Shores adopt the draft bylaw attached. Questions? Councillor Madison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you. Quick question on the land on the development. So nothing can be built there until an archaeological study is done, correct?
Mr. Mayor, through you, either the archaeological study be done or a licensed archaeologist in the province has deemed there to be low potential or no archaeological potential. The approval authority can accept a statement from a licensed archaeologist that says just that.
And the surrounding houses in there, did they all have the same thing, an archaeological survey study done?
For clarification, would you be referring to lots that have already been built out or new proposals, new development proposals going through this process? those dwellings were built, as far as I understand, before there were new regulations and changes to the Planning Act requiring the archaeological assessments.
Any further questions? I guess I'm going to go back to that archaeological thing. I know it's one I always have an issue with, and it's a check sheet, really. It's not a regulation. It's a check sheet that's came out of the ministry office that identifies a number of criteria that you use to say you need it. Because I don't think the check sheet's referred to in any legislation or regulation. It's just, I know the Act says you need to preserve, the Heritage Act says about preserving archaeological sites, but again, it doesn't refer to the check sheet we routinely use.
Is the cost for that on the landowner or the person?
Oh yeah.
Like the person who owns it now or the person who's buying it to build?
Person that buys it or whoever wants to take that holding off to build, to come in here and say we want to take the holding designation off to build something, they have to provide the letter either that, that Leah talked about or an assessment. Oh. Any further questions? All in favor? Opposed, if any, that's carried. So the next one is a staff report again. It has to do with Woodlands and Summerside Subdivision Phase 2. And Jay Posner will present.
Yes, so there's a number of things we're requesting through this report. We're asking for the town to consider entering into a subdivision agreement with Snyder Development Corporation for Phase 2 of the Woodlands subdivision, which is shown on the attached maps. We're asking for the town to enter into a site plan agreement with Snyder Development for the subject lands, and that when those are finally registered, that we have a bylaw authorized to lift the holding provision, which limits construction on those lands. So the Phase 2 lands, as they're shown, as the north of Trillium and east of Acton, they're Phase 2 of a larger development that was draft approved about 7-8 years ago. In this phase, we'll create 26 single attached lots and 3 trail blocks to act as connections to the trail systems that have been either formally or informally used in the area for quite a lengthy time. Snyder Development provided a tree retention plan and specific lot grading details to ensure existing trees are protected as much as possible, and that's sort of the raison d'etre for the site plan agreement. This has been a unique feature of this development, that we have a site plan agreement to protect existing and existing vegetation in the community, and we're experimenting with these lands to determine if that's an appropriate means to use elsewhere in wooded areas where development may be considered. But nevertheless, we're continuing that site plan agreement in this area, and so. The subdivision agreement does what all subdivision agreements do. It secures the infrastructure necessary to serve the development and establishes the requirements for securities and appropriate review and installation of that infrastructure. I should note in this case that, because I had a question from one of the councillors, that parkland was acquired at the first stage of this development back in 2009-2010, so there isn't any further parkland being requested or required through each phase.
All right, thank you, Jay. Then the recommendation is that council authorize the necessary bylaw to enter into a subdivision agreement with Snyder Development Corporation Incorporated for Phase 2 of Woodland Subdivision for council's consideration at a future council meeting. The council authorize the necessary bylaw to enter into a site plan agreement with Snyder Development Corporation for Phase 2 of the Woodland Subdivision for council's consideration at a future council meeting, and that once the subdivision and the site plan agreement are completed and registered, council authorize the necessary bylaw to remove the holding provisions from the zoning bylaw for Phase 2 of Woodland Subdivision at a future council meeting. Any questions or comments to this? Start over. Councillor Grayson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Jay, I really was impressed with the tree retention plan and the lot grading requirements. Just for clarification, did you say that Phase 1 had similar requirements, or is this new?
No, it's phase 1A and 1B as they're called, which is most of the west half of Trillium and a bit of Fenton and Acton on the west side have a site plan agreement dealing with tree retention and log grading as well. It's done in a very similar way to this.
Thank you.
Councillor Dave Mayat.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Jay, the block in the middle, it's called Block 35. Is this the parkland dedication that you're referring to?
No, this is a EP area that's not developable, but the town has acquired it and has a trail through it. But the parkland that was acquired was a combination of cash and the majority of the lands between here and Concession 10 going to the ridge that will be acquired over the development of this subdivision as well as the Summerside subdivision.
Between here or here?
Here, the subdivision and Concession 10. Yeah.
Okay, so we acquired a bunch of that EP area.
Yeah, but it has the trail system. It secured the trail system for us, which was the main purpose.
Okay, good, thank you.
Councillor Mike Mayat.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. It was just my question was similar to your comment, or similar to Councillor Grace about the tree retention bylaw. And Jay, it was just to you, Mr. Mayor, to Jay. Jay, I'm just wondering in regards to the, which is contractors will have an obligation to comply with the tree retention plan. How's that monitored? How strict are we? A lot of lots being developed out there. How do we know that the tree retention bylaw is being adhered to? The trees aren't coming down that are supposed to remain. How strict are we with that? How's it monitored?
Well, this is some of what we've been learning over the past 7-8 years as this subdivision is developed. Is that the first version of the tree retention plan didn't offer the same flexibility that we're building into this one. The previous phases were very strict that no trees could be touched, and it was just not possible either by the construction standards that we wanted to apply to those lots or by just the nature of those trees, so that they were falling or they were creating hazards for construction and the residents. So we've allowed them over time to be removed where they may be hazards for falling or otherwise safety hazards, but also recognized at the same time that even in those no-touch areas there may also be wet areas that are created by from just the non application of any stormwater grading to allow water to drain. So there's a recognition in the site plan agreements now that say these may create some wet areas throughout the year. So we're learning as we go through that we need to offer flexibility and more guidance to the landowners so that the true purpose of the tree retention plan is going to be maintained in the long term. So as we learn, we're modifying it. In this particular case, the developer hired a consultant, did a further investigation of the best way of retaining trees, and eliminated the small pockets of trees that would just die on their own because they weren't getting the proper water, and they were also the root structure was disturbed. So the consultant went out, looked at larger blocks of woodland features to protect and offer the same ecological functions that were done previously. So in other words, allowing wildlife to move freely without hindering their own quality of life, but while allowing the development to proceed. So we're monitoring that sort of just to see is that still going to be as successful as other ways of protecting woodlands.
The comment I just hope, Mr. Mayor, the only comment I wanted to make too is back in 2010-11, we accepted some lands, environmental hazard land for the purpose of trail development. It's just a comment that I think there are a point in time comes where not all environmental hazard property is good land to take over, with our 5% parkland dedication. But if you take a look down there now and look at that trail system between Lord Elgin Estates, for example, over to the 10th concession, it's a wonderful trail system, and it's a good example of sometimes taking environmental hazard property is a good thing. So I think it was a good negotiation. Thanks, Jay.
Councillor Minaj.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I'd like to explore a similar theme and speak to the fact that there are amazing trails down there, and we took some land and some cash in lieu of parkland for these developments. The money that goes into the general pot is then something that surfaces year over year as capital project improvements. So philosophically speaking, I would like to think that some of this trail improvements, there's a trail that's started and it's indicated on the plan of subdivision between Trillium Court and the new road. I forget what is it, the new crescent that's being
Westgate Drive, they're calling it.
Westgate Drive.
Yeah.
Interesting. So between Trillium and Westgate Drive, then there is a goat's path trail right now. There's a stream, a small stream that has a bridge. It's not a very good bridge. It's a bunch of fallen cedar trees, I think, that have been constructed such. So my position is that I think that I understand why we take money in lieu and we put it into a reserve account. What I'd like to suggest is that when it comes to connecting these trails in that area, that when we strike this plan of subdivision fully approved, I'd like us to stipulate that the money from the reserve funds that were taken from this development be allocated to that trail improvement to connect it to the other trails that are there now. There's a new good trail that was developed in the last 2 years from Acton to North Shore Road. So these continuations of trails in that area are good for us and good for them. So is there a way we can include, not wait for the next year of budget discussions, not wait for 2 or 3 years from now, but say as this subdivision develops, that trail will meet our trail standards from connecting one subdivision to the new subdivision?
Well, I think that's part of what we put in the subdivision agreement. We expect the developer to develop that trail in that subdivision agreement to our standard.
Well, I mean,
and if you're talking about the money, I think the money, when we take money, we put that in a parkland reserve, and then it's at the discretion of the people around this table to decide how they want to spend it. I think that's the proper way to do that, because your priorities will change from year to year, whether there's trails here or there, and I think you need that flexibility. No question it should go into a parkland reserve, but where you spend it should be up to the decision of the committee. Did you want to speak?
No, unless there's a particular need. I don't know if there's a question, but if there was...
Sure. Any other questions? My question, and I have no trouble with the site plan agreement, but using the site plan that way, but I think if this is a way that we're going to address subdivisions in the future, I think wouldn't it be better to be as a condition of our standard subdivision agreement that we have it in there so that we have it all included in one document instead of site plan? Because really a subdivision agreement is a site plan agreement, very detailed site plan agreement.
Well, we didn't see it that way in 2010, or I can't remember which year we did the first phase, but we were willing to experiment in how we administer some of the recommendations that came up through various documents. And one way that was recommended that we follow was having a site plan agreement, because the subdivision agreement, although it gets registered at the time of the subdivision being created, it's secured by the developer and really only the short term. So a lot of the teeth in that subdivision agreement, over time, they fall out. They're almost like the baby teeth, whereas the site plan agreement we can secure with the landowner of the lots in perpetuity and deal specifically with whatever issues we wanted to do. We are learning that it maybe isn't the most appropriate way, so you'll have seen it just in the Deer Run Court, we didn't have a site plan agreement recommended on that one. That's not because we own the land, it's because as we're learning, there are other ways of protecting environmental features, and that it's in these sort of safer, small-scale environments we can test some of the theories out and administer them in unique ways. This may not be something we do in Phase 3, but it's something we would continue here because this developer has felt that it's at least appropriate in this particular phase.
Yeah, I don't have a big problem with it. I think it's just, I think it just makes it tidier when it has one agreement instead of
no
two,
question.
and you're complicating things about where site, in my mind, and I have no trouble with it. I just mentioned it and asked you to consider it. Any other questions? All in favor? Well, so that's carried. The next one is a staff report. It has to do pre-servicing agreement with North Meadows Phase 1. And I believe our Dave Posner will present. No, go ahead first. Our CAO would like to speak.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I should have pointed this out earlier, but members of council may notice a slight difference in the look of the reports. And I did want to acknowledge it. It is a slight change, but it is significant. You'll note that in the reports now we are recognizing that most of the reports that you're reading are actually written by staff and not by me and not by senior staff. And we wanted to recognize the excellent work that goes into the reports. So the format of the report is slightly different. It starts with who is the report is from, and that's generally who you'll be hearing speak to the report. And then at the end of the report, it actually acknowledges who wrote the report and who it was reviewed by, and then my approval signature. Just wanted to point that out. It is subtle, but we're attempting to better recognize the excellent work that the staff are doing in these reports. Thank you.
Thanks, David, and I think it's a great improvement or addition. So, Jay, our development coordinator.
Draw your attention in this particular case to the key map, and you'll note that I did not provide a draft plan of subdivision here. I just highlighted the first phase of the draft plan here, and this is because this is a pre-servicing agreement for these lands, and it's a little unique in Saugeen Shores. We haven't done a lot of these, but an opportunity arose that after we hired our Director of Public Works sitting beside me, and hopefully she can answer some of the questions that I'm not able to look at unique ways of securing our infrastructure while protecting the town from the mistakes and that may be made by developers in the development of their subdivisions. And so you'll see that I've outlined in the report that the intent of this agreement is to allow the developer to install the services within the development lands prior to the registration of the individual lots. And so unlike the last agreement, the agreement does deal with all the registration requirements for those lots. This agreement deals just with the infrastructure that's being installed for this development. So if you appreciate the discrepancy there, the benefit to doing so for the developer at least is for the ability to collect securities in a manner that facilitates development and encourages the development of Saugeen Shores. What that's saying is that we don't have to retain 100% securities because we aren't the owner of the infrastructure at this point. Whereas the subdivision agreement, that gets registered, we're the landowner, we're all of a sudden at greater risk of any liability. Here, it's not quite that, so we can be a little more flexible. And so I've outlined in the report just some of the details. If you want to go into that, we can. If not, otherwise, I recommend entering into the pre-servicing agreement with Barry's Construction to facilitate the installation of the required infrastructure. A subdivision agreement will be brought back to council when appropriate, dealing with other issues like developer contributions, parkland requirements, that sort of thing.
Thank you, Jay. Then the recommendation is that council authorize the necessary bylaw to enter into a pre-servicing agreement with Barry's Construction and Insulation Limited for Phase 1 of Northport Meadows subdivision for council's consideration at a future council meeting. Questions? Councilor Minaj.
So I may have missed it. These are blanked off services, or they're fully tied in as they're developed?
At the discretion of the Director of Public Works, the agreement says, and I think that's based on acting reasonably and how well the installation has occurred, whether or not the developer can connect or should connect to those mains, for example, the sewer main or the water main. We've allowed that flexibility in this agreement to make those connections.
What, please? So my consideration then would be, if we don't go ahead with the full development for 10 years, ground settling, moving, it's not fully constructed, it's not fully rigid, tied together, house to house, it's floating a little. Does that make sense? Probably doesn't. An engineer's looking at me and saying, you're full of it, Neil. So the answer is, it's okay, it's solid, it's structured, and it will, once it's in, it's good to go.
Well, I think that's why we're taking some securities. We're not taking zero. So where those things don't line up properly or where they haven't been installed appropriately, we can go in and either redesign them to make them functional or cut them off to make sure they aren't causing problems for future
Deputy Mayor Charbonneau.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I just want to say that I think this is a great thing to do. To create this opportunity for a phased collection of the securities, gives opportunity. This is all about developing. Is all about money and allowing the developers to keep as much of their money in their hands as possible while they proceed through this, while reasonably protecting the town. I think is a good compromise. Something that is going to work well. One issue that I think we have in development in Saugeen Shores is not having enough players able to develop land, because there's a steep hill to climb in terms of your ability to put out the money to get that done. And so anything that we can do to lower that bar and to make it easier is a good step forward. So I just commend you on looking at different ways to do this that are more reasonable and more flexible from the standpoint of developers, while also protecting the town. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Mike Myatt.
Mr. Mayor, just through you to Jay. Jay, could you just, I don't know if we put this map up or not, but explain to me again with the stormwater retention pond. I think explain to me where the water eventually will flow from this area out of this development. And we had discussions several months back about negotiations to do with Summerside Phase 1, Lord Algon Estates, and there was some negotiations happening. And I know we don't want to get into negotiations, dollar figures and all those sorts of things, but is that still being addressed, and where we at with that, and whereabouts, where exactly is the stormwater retention pond on here?
The stormwater retention pond on the key map, I haven't highlighted it. It is essentially just east of where the Suffolk Street is shown. It's the bigger block in the middle western portion of the drawing. It's built to accommodate the entire subdivision, so this will be the final size of the pond block, at least as we know it now, based on the build out of the total subdivision. The water from that storm pond will eventually make its way westerly through the storm system developed by Lord Elgin Estates in Phase 1, and then down over the ridge into that pond, and then ultimately out to Lake Huron. The other part of the question, I'm trying to think my way. What was it?
Mr. Mayor,
yes, sir. This developer has satisfied his requirements to work with the adjacent developer for those stormwater works and road Highland Street construction.
That's been satisfied.
That's been satisfied.
Just for clarity, we'll get another chance to talk about that at the draft plan subdivision agreement. We're just really talking about servicing here tonight.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly. I don't mind sharing it now. There's nothing to negotiate, and there's nothing to go in the future subdivision agreement because it was an agreement between Lord Elgin and Barry's. That's it.
We'll see it much more accurately when you come back with a draft plan of subdivision. Okay. Any further questions? All in favor? That's carried. So the next item on the agenda then is a staff report considering height in planning, and again our development coordinator Jay Posner will present the report.
Yeah, and just by way of an introduction to the report, I just wanted to say that, and I say it in the report, that this is a bit of a first in a series, that good planning means that we have these discussions periodically and with some frequency when issues arise that require our attention. And in this particular, it's almost coincidental, a bit by the pressures of the market that we're bringing height right now. Developers bring it up, and I would say developers are bringing it up with more frequency than they have in the past. So I think it's about time we start looking at this issue. And so what I've outlined in the report is that the historical requirements for height in our zoning bylaw, which are 10 meters in most cases, there isn't a clear indication from my mind why we established that. It looks like, with a few exceptions, the standards that are in our zoning bylaw were established in the 1970s, and I'm not sure totally why. That could be related to fire services. It could have been the design imperative at that time. I doubt it, but it's possible. It could have been a negotiation tactic for people that are looking to build at that time. I don't know. There are exceptions. There's a 9-meter requirement in the western lands near the shore in Southampton. That was done in a very specific way in the OP review from a dozen years or so ago. Anyways, I'm not intending to divert that or digress that much into the detail. I really wanted to highlight that it's important to talk about these issues because planning takes time. it takes consultation, it takes public input. But staff, in having dialogue with these developers, need something to have productive discussions with while we develop the policies and while we develop the regulations. So I'm bringing this report specifically on height to get some council direction and support for the issues that I'm outlining here, so that when we have these discussions with developers, and until we develop the updated design guidelines and updated OP policy and updated zoning bylaw provisions, we have something to guide our discussions. So I've highlighted 6 subject areas that I think should be looked at when we're talking about height. One is compatibility, and that generally, as generally stated, there are some areas that may be inherently more compatible for increases in height than in others, and I've highlighted that, say, the north end of Port Elgin, where it's greenfield development, the impacts are maybe not quite as severe as some other parts of town. I've highlighted the south end of Port Elgin and maybe even downtown Port Elgin. But there may be other locations that exist where additional height may be supported, but provided a number of compatibility issues are addressed and which can be developed in our policy updates. We should maybe look at architectural control, but I think we should be discreet and prioritize the architectural elements that are important to the town. And so to avoid what's maybe happened in the past, I think council needs to articulate just, say, the top 5 architectural elements that are important, so when a height issue arises, we're not looking at an undetermined number of issues that need to be resolved related to architecture. Building and massing and setbacks, it's sort of a subheading of architectural control. But how big buildings are just outside of height and where they're situated on a lot have a significant impact on potential effects in surrounding lands, and we think that further guidance is going to come out of the design guidelines review. Other issues related to site conditions need to be looked at. How close are they to the arterial road system? Landscaping, streetscaping, provision of parking, any of the other issues that might come up. Connectivity with other parts of town should be encouraged, so where there are developments that show increases in height and density and they provide greater connections with our other active transportation trail system, for example, they should be supported. And there could be other trade-offs and I've highlighted. So, for example, where a hotel is maybe proposed, if there's some benefit or potential to benefit the sports tourism objectives in the town's rec master plan, those could be ways of saying, well, we're going to get the sports tourism increase, so we can allow a greater increase in height to help support and buttress that market or that objective. And so I've concluded by saying that these are going to be evaluated when we look at the town's OP, zoning bylaw, site plan control bylaw, and design guidelines over the next few months. And I do want to end by saying that none of these, and I have to stress this seems like every time, is that none of these are considered in isolation. And we often get burdened with evaluating these on the assumption that we're ignoring something else. But of course, that's not what we do. We look at all matters and determine, based on the relative merits of the proposal, how each impact the community, and come up with what is provides the most net benefit to the community when we make the recommendation. I just wanted to conclude.
Thank you, Jay. There is a recommendation, then we can have a discussion on this. The recommendation is that increases in the height for non-residential or mixed-use developments are appropriate when satisfactorily addressing the matters contained herein, and that council supports staff by expressing a willingness to engage in using height relief as a development option to be considered. Councillor McMahon.
Just a comment, Mr. Mayor, and I just think anything we can do to help accommodate growth in this community and not be so prohibitive in terms of height restrictions that's going to discourage growth in our community is I think anything we can do to ease that burden in terms of height is a good thing. So I think we have been a little bit too restrictive, so I'm pleased to see that we're tackling this area, Mr. Mayor.
Thanks, Mike. Councillor Grace.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Jay, I noticed when you were giving examples about trade-offs and you were talking about the sports tourism and the possibility of accommodating a daycare center. I didn't see anything in the report about what I think most people consider to be probably our most important asset, our waterfront properties. And I am concerned about the possibility of multi-use developments or mixed-use developments or commercial developments going up on the waterfront. We do have a 5-story development at the waterfront in Port Elgin right now. Right beside it, I noticed it as I was driving past tonight, there's a lot for sale. And, you know, I'm just concerned about making sure that whatever restrictions we have, that we have some kind of special consideration for our waterfront properties. But I wondered if you would comment on what your thoughts are about waterfront development.
Well, maybe it's too easy for me to say that because I was trained as a planner, I'd like to be able to consult with members of the public before I make my recommendation. But I also think there may be opportunities to look in a comprehensive way, and I can't say that it would be necessarily articulated in a great level of detail by town staff, because we're not the developer rather of a potential waterfront development. We're maybe responding to something that might come along. So it would be important to say, if something like that apartment condo came again at the waterfront, what are the things we might want to do differently to firstly consider whether it's appropriate, and if we do consider it appropriate, how do we accommodate that by having the least amount of impact? So are there things, because I wouldn't want to exclude the waterfront, on its own as a potential location for development. It's there may be, and again, this may be to my detriment, there may be opportunities to have a proposal that does tick all the boxes, and that on balance is a net benefit to the community. But having said that, I'm certainly open to the idea that maybe that's a priority area that town doesn't want to touch, and whereas I'm certainly open to taking council direction to say that it shouldn't be considered once we go through the consultation process.
Sorry, just a follow-up. I wasn't precluding the idea of waterfront development of any sort, but just a height restriction, because I think the vista is an important asset for our public. It is a core part of our tourism brand, of our destination, and I would really hate to see our waterfront look like part of Collingwood's. And, obviously it's very valuable property, but that's my concern, is maintaining a height restriction on the waterfront.
Councillor Minot.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, Cheryl, I'm going to go a little bit different there. I'm going to say I'd like to see a two-pronged approach. I would really like to look at, for example, Devonshire apartment construction, where there's no neighbors at the moment. Well, why couldn't we go 10 stories? Why not? And yet, my neighbors built an extension on their property and invaded all of my swimming pool privacy in my backyard, and killed my roses with their building, taking out the sunlight, and so on. So let's take 2 tourist camps that are owned and operated by the municipality. Let's say we offer those to developers to build 10-story high condo towers looking out over Chantry Island and the lakes. They're not waterfront. They're backed way off of the waterfront, but they do it in Myrtle Beach. They do it in other ocean vistas and places. They build hotel towers and condo towers with beautiful views, and it's a great development opportunity. And it's possible that maybe we should be really getting out of the box, Mr. Mayor, and get Jay to have his drone license and purchase a drone, and he should be operating the drone around different areas of the community with cameras so that he can see the effect of how a 2 or 3 story or a 4 or 5 or 10 story building, looking down, what would we see? And so I mean, we laugh, but let's use science to our advantage and say to ourselves, we believe, we have an opinion that it's going to be detrimental in some areas, and maybe in the middle of an already established subdivision it would be, but maybe in some of our vacant lands that say for example, the land that's vacant between the Independent and the Jehovah's Witness Church that's ready for development. What effect might it be, could it have on people's light and view and privacy? So there are, I'm sure other communities have gone through this. When I went to Vancouver and looked at West Vancouver, they are stacked up the hillside, and they are as big as they can construct and build them, and they've all got beautiful views, and they're worth a fortune, and everybody loves them. So, and yet there are residential areas in Vancouver that are being inundated with condo development in the middle of very expensive residential neighborhoods that have swimming pools and single-family dwellings. So I get the message. I wondered if there's a two-pronged attack could be instituted, where we say where there's established vacant lands with PD plan development on them now, maybe we can, if the fire chief says his ladder trucks can reach and adequately look after 10 stories, then let's take the shackles off and allow 10 stories now. And on the other hand, if we're trying to do some infilling and intensification in lots, and we want to build a condo tower in the middle of a downtown street system with a vacant lot, maybe that's mostly inappropriate, and we ought to be using that drone to figure that out.
Deputy Mayor Charbonneau.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Of course, there'll be lots of disagreement on lots of areas of this, but I think that one area where there is no disagreement, I don't think we'd find disagreement around the table. Maybe I'm wrong. I'll find out in a second. Is the highway commercial corridor in the town of Port Elgin. We don't need a height restriction there. We can build taller buildings there, so I think that I would like to see us move on that and target that area and lift those restrictions, because we can do it. We could do it by consensus. I almost imagine this council would approve that change to our official plan zoning bylaws and just get that done. And there may be other areas, I don't know, but can we have an approach where we pick the low hanging fruit like that, where we know that we would accept taller development and send the signal. I mean, I think what you've done here is good, and I understand what you're doing. You're moving. We're trying to send a signal here now to say we would consider height relief, and so I think that we would. But hopefully, I wonder, can we get to the next step in fairly short order on some of this easier, easier maybe isn't the right word, but some of the less controversial parts of this, and send that signal in those less controversial areas so that we can sweep this regulation out of the way. I think I know the reason. You weren't sure the reason why this happened in the 70s. I think I know why. Regulation creep. That's what happens. These regulations just kind of creep up on you. They come in from somewhere and keep building up and building up and building up, and this one just isn't necessary, and probably was never necessary, particularly in our highway commercial areas. So I'd like to see us move. I'd like to see us move aggressively in those areas, and I wonder, can we do that?
Well, firstly, if there is some sort of consensus on what low-hanging fruit is, I would say we could move aggressively, because we'd have pretty clear direction on what we want. It's just a matter of getting the support of the county to process the appropriate amendments through the process.
Done? Sure, go ahead.
I think that I'm trying to identify that area for you. The highway commercial zones in the town of Port Elgin.
I've written it, but
and I think that I'll ask my colleagues to tell me if they think I'm way off base there, but I think that we should seriously consider that area, and perhaps staff could give me some advice maybe on how we could kickstart a consideration of lifting the height restrictions in that area, or how you'd like to get that direction from council. But I'd like to see us move on that. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I think we would be fairly specific tonight, or to at least get you to the next step and get ready for an amendment. I think Councillor Dave Mayette would like to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Without going into great detail, too, I'll just start off by saying I too wondered a long time where this came from, and I think in conversation with some people around this table, I've expressed a desire similar to what Jay is proposing here. But just for clarification, Jay, what you're recommending here is that the 10-meter restriction be just eliminated, and that when a developer potentially comes in and says they want to build a building taller than 10 meters, the answer they get isn't necessarily a hard no. It is, where do you want to do it? And then the recommendation would come back to us, depending whether it's close to the waterfront, or whether it's close to another building that's already existing, or whether it's a discrete area on its own. Is that what you're proposing here?
No, not as in terms of a blanket remove the restriction. I would say to consult on the appropriate areas in town where a greater height may be permitted, and I would still recommend having some limit. For example, maybe our fire services will say, because I haven't consulted them, maybe they'll say there isn't a hard limit. Now, I know conceptually that's not the case, because even in Toronto, their trucks don't reach to the top of those towers. They have other ways of mitigating that. But what does that entail? And maybe we don't need to go that far. We're still a smallish urban center. I don't think we need to eliminate the height restriction. But if there are particular hard limits, they can be built into the zoning bylaw much more easily if we can figure out what that is. Is it 6 stories in the case of the highway corridor? Again, I don't propose that as a recommendation, but just as something to think about. Because we aren't seeing, I don't think we're seeing developers say they need 20 stories. We're not hearing that. We're hearing that even modest height increases are difficult, and they need more certainty in understanding what's permitted, where it's permitted, and how do they go about mitigating impacts. And so we're looking at what are the issues that we need to resolve.
Councilor Minaj.
Thanks for allowing another round here, and I do like the concept of exploring and maybe having a no height policy, but site specific, as the way to resolve this issue. But I would go against the deputy mayor and state that there's a certain car wash in the municipality of Port Elgin, the old municipality of Port Elgin, and that if we'd have had our chance again, that would never be built. And certainly we wouldn't want, from the noise perspective alone, but we certainly wouldn't want to build 10 stories abutting residential. So I don't think we could do a blanket highway commercial as okay. So I challenge back that the residential units that are next to that particular car wash, they've got their hands full with the car wash, let alone 10 stories. So if we decided to go 10 stories, it would be looking straight over and down backed onto residential. And I'm sure that the people in Southampton backing onto Tim Hortons and the subway and car wash there wouldn't want to see 10 stories right next to their residential units either. So I think that there's a way to control this, but if you don't have it every point listed, then it's a parade of people coming in saying, well, I've got this lot, I've got this highway commercial lot, and I want to build 5 stories, I want to build 10 stories, what do you think? And we're going to have to, we have to be very careful how we arbitrate that.
I think, any further questions? Have you got enough information? I think if you go back to the first paragraph in the recommendation where there is appropriate and satisfactory addressing some matters, that those are the things I think we're struggling with, is what matters are we need to address. And I'm fully confident I think we can get those. I think the first step is to say we're open to this idea of higher buildings, but we're not open to it everywhere, and there will be some conditions about where they should be appropriate, because I think all of us agree that they're not appropriate everywhere. I don't think there's going to be 100 applicants in the next year or even 10 years. But the other thing, it does send a message when bigger developments, I know you go and see developments in other communities, bigger developments, and developers look at that, look at our restrictions. And capital will go wherever it can, and it will go very easily where it's much easier to build, and that's what happens. You'll see developments leave this community and go elsewhere because of those restrictions. So I think it generally sends a message that, yes, we're open to these ideas, but we have some concerns about where they should be and where they are appropriate. And that's the same wherever they are. It's not unusual that you would see that in Saugeen Shores. It's the same everywhere. One more time, Mike.
Mr. Mayor, I just and I echo your sentiments. I think investment developer dollars will go where I believe as well, where there are fewer restrictions. And I remember one application not long ago on Highway 21 that we pretty much said to the developer to lower your height restriction from 5 floors to 4 floors. Was that the right decision? Looking back, maybe not. If we hadn't had that height restriction on, so regimented at that point in time, that might have been a little bit more smoother sailing. I think anytime, again, I'll repeat what I said earlier, anytime we can, I think, reduce the amount of restrictions we're placing on these developers from a height restriction standpoint, one example, the better. I mean, we got a municipality not 25, 30 minutes away that surely will take that investment real quick. And the only question I had, Jay, to you, Mr. Jay, is I still believe in compatibility. And I think that, how do we, could you quickly just, Jay, for me, around the table, when you define compatibility, and is that, is one of your criteria in your town should consider compatibility?
Yeah. Just
quickly, what does that mean?
Well, we got a pretty good definition from the county not a month ago on what compatible meant, and that it doesn't mean, it's used, maybe fortunate they used it in the negative, but it was that compatible doesn't mean the same. It doesn't necessarily mean even similar to. It just means can it function without measurable negative impact on surrounding uses. Yeah, I used the example of a married couple that we're compatible, we're not the same. So I would take it more of that sort of a definition of what compatible means.
I mean, I heard the explanation as well what compatibility meant a month or two ago, and I think the highway commercial, just to say, let's designate all of that, and put this height restriction on it, and lower those expectations from the town's behalf. Is one, 10-foot high building compatible at this location, but not compatible right down the road? That's my only question. So when you get down to the compatibility, the town should consider. That to me is, how do we determine?
I can't give a direct answer because compatible is context dependent.
Anyway, that was just.
Okay, I think we've had a fairly good discussion. You're confident that you can come back with something, DJ?
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends. Did I get the low-hanging fruit answer? I don't know if I did, but we'll certainly be working through the design guidelines.
I think you've got a general consensus that they're certainly looking to be more flexible on height and raise that the present height restrictions are not compatible with a bunch of us. So I guess, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to make the point that whatever we do, we have to, the right thing to do here is to come up with a single consistent policy that we can apply generally in the absence of a specific application. Like what we're doing here now is really just saying we would be open to considering it, but what's going to happen still is we're going to get an application, come back here, probably be controversial. It's going to arrive here and we're going to decide yes or no, up or down, whether or not it should clear the height restriction or the height restriction should apply or not. And that is not that does not lead to ideal planning circumstances in my mind. The best thing that we can do is have a general policy and have it soon that says, yes, you can build over a certain height or up to a certain height or maybe an unlimited height, but we have to have that in the absence of an application so that it can be applied by our staff and be applied consistently, and people can have confidence when they come to build things in the community, and they don't have to worry about coming before a tribunal and not being sure what's going to happen because all sorts of things get in the way. So that's what I just give. So my message there is, can we have that soon so that we can move beyond the one-off situations.
And I think that in my mind that was in the intent of what Jay was going to come back with something, what I would say very specific about your height restrictions are this.
No, if you permit me,
sure.
Mr. Mayor, it's that the design guidelines offer an opportunity to do that. We're reviewing them now. We've accepted the proposal from a proponent. They haven't yet contacted us whether they've accepted it, but let's leave it there. And what we'll be using with this report is that be able to talk with them, our experts, when they go through the design guideline review, and assist staff and the consultation process to focus discussion, so we can get the best consultation and the best information we can to develop the general policy that will allow us to move forward. And we can do it in a timely way because we still want to do that by the end of the summer. So.
Yeah, and I guess I'm like Luke. I think my end game is to remove that existing height restriction in our documents and replace it with something much higher. Okay? Okay? Okay. Councillor Grease.
So, I thought I heard from the deputy mayor that he was suggesting a limited rollout of this in certain areas. But then I just heard removing the height restriction totally, and just so I am not in favor of totally removing it.
I think in my intent, and here we're parsing it here, and I don't mean to be, what was in this recommended in here. Not everywhere, no. Where staff expression of height relief, it goes on about non-residential mixed uses are appropriate, non-residential or mixed use developments. So, okay.
Thank you.
We'll have a good discussion when you come back with. I think what we're trying to frame is give him some really good guidelines to come back with an amendment. Okay, all in favor of the recommendation? That's carried. It's the end of our agenda. Motion to adjourn. Councillor Wyatt and Deputy Mayor Charbonneau, all in favor? We're adjourned.